A single scream echoes through the cold stone halls of a forgotten castle. This is the enduring sound of the legend of Elizabeth Báthory, the noble woman history remembers as the Blood Countess. But the true story is far stranger than the simple tales of a monster. By the end of this journey, you will see the blurred line between historical fact and a deliberate campaign of dark propaganda. We'll venture into the uncensored archives to ask why a woman of immense power was accused of bathing in blood, and whether her actions were simple cruelty or a twisted form of occult pursuit. What does this ancient story tell us about the fear of powerful women? The name Bathory was whispered with a mixture of fear and respect across 16th century Europe. Elizabeth did not emerge from a vacuum, but from a dynasty so powerful it was considered a state within a state. Her family tree was rooted in the very soil of Transylvanian and Hungarian power, with relatives holding titles as princes and voivodes, commanding armies, and influencing royal succession. Their wealth was legendary, drawn from vast estates that stretched across the Carpathian Basin, making them one of the richest families on the continent. This was not mere aristocracy. It was a rival court, operating with its own laws and its own formidable private army. Yet, a shadow seemed to follow this immense power. Whispers traveled through the noble courts, tales of a cursed bloodline tainted by madness and a strange, falling sickness we would now call epilepsy. Some even spoke in hushed tones of devil worship, of a family so ambitious they had made pacts in the dark to secure their dominance. This was the world Elizabeth Báthory entered in 1560, a world of gilded privilege built upon a foundation of whispered fears. She was born not just into wealth, but into a legacy of absolute authority and the dark rumors that inevitably cling to it. How does a person navigate such an inheritance, where power and paranoia are two sides of the same coin? At just 15, Elizabeth entered a union designed to consolidate empires. Her marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy was a masterstroke of political strategy, uniting two of the most formidable families in Hungary. He was a celebrated warrior, known across the land as the Black Hero of Hungary for his fierce campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Together, their combined wealth and influence were almost unimaginable, a force that could challenge kings. Their primary home became the formidable Čachtice Castle, a stone fortress perched high on a hill, a symbol of their unassailable power. From the outside, Elizabeth's life was the picture of noble duty. She managed their sprawling estates with a sharp mind, overseeing hundreds of servants, vast agricultural lands, and complex financial matters during her husband's long absences. Yet this period of supposed normalcy was the very crucible that forged her future. With Ferenc constantly away at war, Elizabeth was left in sole command, a woman wielding absolute authority in a man's world, isolated in a remote castle. The long, lonely years without her husband's presence, coupled with the immense pressure of her responsibilities, began to twist the fabric of her reality. It was in this echoing silence, within the cold stone walls of Cachtice, that the first whispers of her cruelty were said to have begun. How does solitude and unchecked power change a person, especially one born into a legacy shadowed by darkness? The first cracks in Elizabeth's noble facade appeared not with grand atrocities, but in the small, private world of her household. Isolated within Cachtice Castle, her fascination with discipline began to curdle into something far darker. She developed a chillingly creative array of punishments for her servants, acts that went far beyond the typical harshness of the era. A misplaced pin could lead to a girl having her fingers held in a hot iron until they blistered. A poorly folded garment might result in being stripped and doused with freezing water in the dead of winter. These were not just corrections, they were brutal experiments in control, carried out behind the castle's thick walls. Her status provided the perfect shield, as the word of a countess was unassailable against the testimony of a mere maid. The local authorities, beholden to her family's power, turned a blind eye to the whispers of suffering that seeped from the fortress. Then the whispers grew louder, shifting from injury to fatality. A young servant girl, new to the castle, was reported to have died suddenly. The official story was a brief, tragic illness, and the matter was quietly settled with a payment to the girl's family. Another death followed, attributed to a fall down a steep staircase. These early tragedies were efficiently covered up, buried by wealth and influence. They were the quiet, hidden rehearsals for the horrors to come, the testing of boundaries to see how far her power could truly reach before anyone would dare to challenge it. What does it reveal when a person discovers they can act with absolute impunity, when the very structures meant to uphold justice instead enable their darkest impulses? Into this isolated world of growing cruelty stepped a new and pivotal figure, a woman named Cachtice. The servants and locals knew her as Aunt Dorka, a widow from a nearby village who was deeply versed in the old folk magic that lingered in the Hungarian countryside. She was not a simple peasant. She was a practitioner, a keeper of ancient knowledge concerning herbs, charms, and the darker arts that existed just beyond the edge of the church. When Countess Báthory brought her into the castle's inner circle, it was a fateful turning point. Dorka did not introduce simple malice. She offered a system. Where Elizabeth's punishments had been impulsive acts of rage, Dorka provided a twisted structure, a methodology rooted in occult belief. She is often credited with transforming random brutality into a calculated ritual, suggesting that pain and blood were not just tools for punishment, but potential sources of power. It is here, in the collaboration between the noblewoman and the occult tutor, that the most infamous legend finds its likely origin. The notion of bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve youth and beauty does not emerge from historical court documents, but it aligns perfectly with the kind of folk magic Dorka would have known. These were ancient, superstitious remedies whispered in the region for centuries, the idea that the vital force of the young could be stolen to rejuvenate the old. Under Dorka's guidance, the torture of servants may have evolved from mere discipline into a grotesque form of experimentation, a search for hidden power through the most terrible means imaginable. How does a simple desire for control become a full-blown occult pursuit? And who truly bears the responsibility, the student or the teacher who showed her the path? The machinery of terror within Cachtice Castle required more than two minds to operate. It was a household within a household, a secret society of tormentors bound by loyalty, fear, or a shared descent into darkness. Beyond Cachtice, a small group of trusted servants formed the Countess's inner circle, each playing a specialized role in the escalating horrors. Alona Jo, the household nurse, was a figure of grim authority. Her position, which should have been one of care and healing, was perverted into one of expert cruelty. She was known for her knowledge of the human body's limits, a knowledge she used not to mend, but to break. She could administer beatings that inflicted maximum pain without causing immediate death, prolonging the suffering of the victims under the guise of discipline. Then there was Katerina Beneka, the washerwoman. Her task was one of grim finality, the cleaning and disposal of the evidence. She was the silent eraser of the crimes, scrubbing the stone floors and laundering the blood-stained linens, her daily work a constant testament to the atrocities unfolding around her. Perhaps the most complex figure was Janos Ujvari, known to all as Fixco. As a dwarf, his position in the castle was inherently precarious, his survival dependent on the whims of his powerful mistress. His role was often that of a procurer and a lookout, using his perceived harmlessness to move through the castle and the surrounding villages unnoticed. His motivations were likely a desperate mixture of self-preservation, and the intoxicating feeling of power that comes from being on the inside of a terrible secret, even as a subordinate. This was the dark synergy that allowed the crimes to continue for years. The Countess provided the authority and the impunity, Dorothea the occult framework, Alona the technical skill, Katerina the cleanup, and Fixco the eyes and ears. Together, they created a self-contained system of abuse, a closed loop where each member's action enabled the next, ensuring that no single scream would ever be loud enough to break through the walls they had built around their secret world. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a willing cog in such a machine? And does following orders in the shadow of great power absolve one of guilt? Beneath the grand halls and stately rooms of Čachtice Castle lay another world entirely. A labyrinth of cold, damp stone corridors wound their way deep into the earth, leading to the dungeons where the Countess' private world of torment was hidden from the sun. These were not simple prison cells, but a carefully maintained theater of pain, equipped with tools for every conceivable form of suffering. The air in these chambers was thick with the smell of rust, old straw, and a lingering metallic scent that never seemed to fade. In one corner, a heavy wooden rack stood ready to stretch a body beyond its limits, its iron cranks waiting for a turn. Nearby, iron maidens, those terrifying sarcophagi lined with inward-facing spikes, stood like silent sentinels, promising a slow, piercing end for anyone sealed inside. But it was the smaller, more personal instruments that often painted the most horrifying picture. There were slender, sharpened needles used for piercing the skin beneath fingernails, and pairs of specially designed scissors, their blades strong enough to sever a finger with a single, clean cut. The infamous cage, a spiked contraption suspended from the ceiling, would be lowered over a victim, its sharp points biting into flesh with every involuntary shudder. This was not a place of chaotic violence, but one of meticulous, almost ritualistic cruelty. Each device had a specific purpose, a calculated method for extracting not just screams, but something more intangible from its victims. How does a space become so saturated with suffering that the very stones seem to absorb the echoes of every cry? The true horror of Cachtice Castle was not in a single act of madness, but in the chillingly systematic nature of the suffering. The testimonies from the trial, spoken by her own accomplices and surviving servants, paint a picture of a household where torture was a daily routine, a calculated process designed to prolong agony. The victims were almost always young women, peasant girls, and sometimes daughters of minor nobility sent to the castle for education or work, who simply vanished from the world. One common method described was the ice bath. A girl would be stripped and forced into a courtyard in the dead of winter, where servants would pour freezing water over her until her body turned blue and she collapsed, often never to rise again. Another was the honey torture, where a victim would be stripped, covered in honey, and left tied up outside to be tormented by insects and the sun. The beatings were not random outbursts. They were prolonged and expert, administered with clubs and whips by Alona Joe, who knew precisely how to bruise and break the flesh without causing immediate death. The most calculated cruelty, however, involved needles. Thin, sharp needles were used to pierce the sensitive skin beneath fingernails and around the lips, a method of inflicting intense, focused pain that left few visible marks. Some girls were forced into the spiked cage, suspended from the ceiling, where the slightest movement would drive the metal points deeper into their bodies. The testimonies speak of prolonged starvation, of being locked in tiny, airless closets for days on end. Death did not come quickly. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling of a human life, a process overseen with a detached, almost experimental interest. This was not the chaotic rage of a single individual, but the output of a well-oiled machine of torment, where each member of the inner circle had a specific role in the infliction and management of pain. Why would such detailed, methodical suffering be recorded and repeated? If not in the pursuit of something beyond simple cruelty, what dark purpose could possibly require such a gruesome and consistent ritual? This infamous legend, the bloodbath itself, feels like something ripped from the darkest of fairy tales. The idea that Elizabeth Báthory sought eternal youth by bathing in the vital fluid of virgin girls is the cornerstone of her monstrous reputation. Yet, when we sift through the actual historical records from her trial, this specific, grisly detail is nowhere to be found. It emerges not from sworn testimony, but from the whispers that began to circulate years after her arrest, growing more elaborate with each telling. So how did this particular story take such a powerful hold on the human imagination? The answer lies at the crossroads of fear, superstition, and a very ancient form of magic. Across countless cultures and centuries, blood has been revered as the very essence of life, a substance brimming with potent energy. In many ancient traditions, from the secret rites of European alchemists to the shamanic practices of the steppes, blood was seen as a direct conduit to vitality and power. Alchemists sought the philosopher's stone not just to create gold, but to distill the legendary elixir of life, a substance that would grant immortality. In this esoteric worldview, what could be a more powerful, more direct ingredient than the blood of a young, pure maiden, believed to be saturated with unreleased life force? The legend of the bloodbath fits perfectly into this archetype. It transforms a story of horrific cruelty into a narrative of twisted occult pursuit. It suggests that Elizabeth and her accomplices were not merely torturing and killing, but were engaged in a perverted form of alchemy, attempting to literally steal the youth and vitality of their victims and absorb it through the skin. From a purely practical standpoint, the idea is fraught with problems. Blood coagulates quickly, it carries disease, and the sheer volume needed for a bath would have been immense, requiring the death of many girls for a single macabre ritual. This logistical nightmare makes it unlikely as a frequent, literal practice, but the power of the legend is not in its physical truth. Its power comes from what it represents. The bloodbath is a perfect metaphor for the ultimate corruption of power, the belief that one can consume the very lives of others for personal gain. It encapsulates the fear of the aging, powerful aristocrat who would sacrifice the innocent to cling to her beauty and influence. Whether a literal event or a powerful symbolic story, this legend forces us to confront a terrifying question. Is it more frightening to think of a woman who was simply a sadistic murderer, or one whose cruelty was so profound it was mistaken for a dark and desperate search for magic itself? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that this was not simple sadism. The sheer repetition, the ritualistic nature of the torture, points toward a darker, more structured belief system at work. To understand Elizabeth Báthory, we must look beyond the dungeons of Cachtice and into the intellectual undercurrents of the Renaissance. This was an era obsessed with hidden knowledge, where the lines between science, religion, and magic were profoundly blurred. Alchemists in their laboratories sought not just to turn lead into gold, but to uncover the secret of life itself, the ultimate elixir that would grant immortality. Within these esoteric circles, a powerful concept persisted, the idea of a vital life force. In Eastern traditions, it was called prana, a subtle energy that animates all living things. In the West, alchemists and occultists spoke of a similar essence, a spiritual fire contained within the blood. They believed this force was most potent in the young, especially in virgins whose life energy was still contained and unspent. If such a force existed, then the logic of dark magic was chillingly straightforward. This vital essence could, in theory, be harvested and transferred. The suffering of the victim was not just a byproduct, it could be a crucial component, a method to intensify and release this spiritual energy at the moment of death, making it available for capture. From this twisted perspective, the blood was not merely a symbol, it was a literal conduit, a liquid vehicle for stealing the very spark of youth. The systematic torture then becomes a gruesome form of alchemical ritual, a desperate and monstrous attempt to distill the elixir of life from the agony of innocent girls. This transforms the narrative from a story of a cruel woman into something far more archetypal, the tale of a powerful figure who believed the rules of mortality did not apply to her, who was willing to venture into the darkest corners of occult practice in a futile quest to cheat death itself. Was Elizabeth Báthory a student of these forbidden philosophies, guided by her occult tutor Dorothea to believe she could literally bathe in stolen vitality? The historical evidence is circumstantial, but the pattern of her actions fits this dark template all too well. It suggests a mind convinced that ultimate power lay not just in land and gold, but in the very substance of life, a substance she felt entitled to take. But a story this dark demands we ask who benefits from the monster's creation. The whispers of a political conspiracy are not a modern invention to absolve her, but a compelling counter-narrative with deep roots in the harsh realities of 17th century power. At the heart of this theory lies a simple, brutal fact of money and land. King Matthias II, the ruler of Hungary, was drowning in debt, a significant portion of which was owed directly to Elizabeth Báthory. Her vast estates were a glittering prize, a solution to his financial woes if only they could be seized. But a noble woman of her stature, with her powerful family connections, was virtually untouchable under normal law. The only way to legally confiscate her lands was to convict her of a crime so heinous it would shatter her status and justify the crown stepping in. Her gender and her unprecedented autonomy made her the perfect target. Here was a woman who commanded armies of servants, managed colossal finances, and wielded authority that rivaled any male lord, all while her husband was away or after his death. To the powerful men surrounding the king, she was an anomaly, a threat to the natural order. Destroying her was not just about settling a debt, it was about reasserting control and sending a clear message to any other woman who might dare to stand so tall. The accusations provided the perfect tool. Charges of witchcraft and sadistic murder against a female ruler played directly into the superstitions and fears of the era, guaranteeing public outrage and making her defenders fall silent. The witness testimonies, many extracted under duress from her own servants who were promised leniency, constructed a case designed to shock and horrify, to ensure no one would look too closely at the king's financial motivations. So we are left with a haunting question. Did the king and her political rivals merely expose a monster that already existed, or did they actively help to create one, weaving together strands of truth, exaggeration, and outright fiction to craft a legend monstrous enough to justify their theft? The stage for this final act was not a court of justice, but a political theater meticulously designed for a single outcome. The trial of 1611 was a judicial farce from its very inception, a proceeding so deeply flawed it casts a long shadow of doubt over every accusation. Elizabeth Báthory, the primary defendant, was never permitted to appear before her judges, nor was she allowed to testify in her own defense. She remained imprisoned in her own castle, a silent, absent figure at the center of a storm of words spoken about her. This alone violated the legal customs of the time, stripping her of the most basic right to confront her accusers. The evidence presented was overwhelmingly composed of hearsay and secondhand accounts, a chorus of whispers gathered from over 300 witnesses. But the most damning testimonies, the ones that painted the most vivid pictures of torture, came from her own accomplices, Dorothea Schenz, Alona Joe, and Janos Fixco. Their words were not given freely. These key witnesses were themselves tortured extensively before they ever spoke a word in court. Their confessions were extracted through excruciating pain, a process guaranteed to produce whatever narrative their interrogators desire to hear. How can we trust the testimony of someone who is being systematically broken when every scream and every admission is a bargaining chip for a less horrific death? The entire proceeding was orchestrated by Count Georgi Thurzo, the very man who had led the raid on her castle. Thurzo was not an impartial official. He was a political rival, a creditor to the king, and the man who stood to gain immense prestige and power from her downfall. He handpicked the judges, he controlled the flow of information, and he shaped the narrative that would be presented to a horrified public. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, written not by the law, but by the political and financial necessities of the Hungarian crown. The trial was not an investigation. It was a performance, a public relations campaign to legitimize the destruction of a powerful woman and the seizure of her legendary wealth. If the evidence was so overwhelming, why was such a blatantly irregular process necessary? The answer suggests a terrifying truth, that the real crime may not have been the murders, but the threat her power posed to the men who sat in judgment. The confessions that sealed Elizabeth Báthory's fate were not given in a quiet courtroom, but were ripped from the mouths of her accomplices under the most extreme duress. Before Dorothea Schenz or Alona Joe ever spoke a word to the judges, they were subjected to the very same tortures they were accused of administering. Their fingers were crushed in thumbscrews, their bodies were stretched on the rack, and their skin was seared with hot irons. A confession extracted in such a state is not a search for truth, but a transaction of agony. A person being systematically broken will say anything, will describe any horror, if they believe it will make the pain stop for a single moment. The testimonies they provided were unnervingly similar, often repeating the same phrases and specific details, as if the witnesses had been fed a script to memorize and repeat. This strange uniformity suggests not a shared experience, but a shared source of information, a narrative carefully constructed by the interrogators. Furthermore, the numbers of victims cited in these statements are wildly inconsistent, ranging from a few dozen to several hundred, a variance that points more to a desire to shock and overwhelm than to document factual evidence. Why would a legal proceeding so reliant on such tainted and contradictory accounts refuse to hear from the one person who could challenge them, the Countess herself? The answer lies in the purpose of the trial. It was not a quest for justice, but a necessary performance to legitimize a political execution. The coerced witness statements were not evidence of her crimes. They were the script for her destruction, written in advance and spoken by actors who were themselves under the whip. The verdict arrived not as a surprise, but as a carefully calibrated act of political theater. Her accomplices, the commoners Dorothea Schenz and Alona Joe, met a brutal public end. Their fingers, the very instruments accused of inflicting so much pain, were systematically torn from their hands with red-hot pincers before they were burned alive at the stake. Janos Fixco, for his cooperation, was beheaded, a marginally quicker death, but for Elizabeth Báthory, the noblewoman, the punishment was different. The court could not publicly execute a woman of her exalted bloodline, as it would create a dangerous precedent and risk angering her still powerful family. Instead, they devised a sentence that was both a mercy and a profound cruelty. She was to be immured, walled alive, within a small set of rooms in her own castle at Čachtice. This was not merely imprisonment. In the esoteric traditions that swirled around her story, entombment carries a deep, symbolic weight. To be walled in is to be removed from the flow of life, to be placed in a state of living death, suspended between worlds. It is a ritual of erasure, a magical act meant to contain a dangerous, corrupting force without spilling noble blood, which was considered sacrosanct. The stones themselves became her jailers, sealing her away from the sun, from society, and from the very air of the living. For a woman accused of stealing the life force of others, this was a poetically dark inversion, a sentence that slowly drained her own vitality while leaving her body technically alive. The small opening left in her prison wall, through which food would be passed, was not an act of compassion. It was a breathing tube for a corpse, a constant reminder of the world that continued just beyond her stone cocoon. For 3 years, she existed in this twilight, a living ghost in the fortress that had been the seat of her immense power. What thoughts haunted a mind left in such absolute silence, with only the echoes of her own legend for company? Her final punishment forces us to wonder whether the true horror was the death of the body, or the deliberate, slow extinction of a soul. Silence became her only companion. For 4 long years, Elizabeth Báthory lived within a world reduced to a few small, sealed rooms in the castle that had once been her kingdom. The bustling noise of the household, the whispers of her servants, the distant cries from the dungeons, all of it was replaced by an oppressive, unbroken quiet. Food was passed through a narrow slit in the masonry, the only connection to the outside world, a world that had already begun to turn her into a legend. She was a living secret, a story the kingdom had walled up to forget, yet could not stop telling. What does a mind accustomed to absolute power dwell upon in such profound isolation? The official records state she died on the evening of August 21st, 1614. A guard, peering through the food slot, found her lying on the floor, her body still. The official cause was listed vaguely as general weakness, a slow fading away after years of confinement, but such a sterile explanation feels utterly inadequate for a life, and a death so shrouded in darkness. It invites more questions than it answers. Did her spirit simply surrender to the crushing weight of her solitude, or was there a more deliberate end to her suffering? Legends, of course, offer a more dramatic conclusion. One persistent tale claims she was found face down, a final, cruel irony for a woman accused of bathing in blood. Another whispers that she simply vanished, that the body found was a decoy, and she escaped to live out her days in a hidden convent, her terrible knowledge buried with her. Then there are the ghost stories. Visitors to the ruins of Čachtice Castle report a lingering, cold presence, the sound of a woman weeping from behind walls that no longer exist, or the fleeting glimpse of a pale figure in a dark gown staring from a window that has been empty for centuries. These spectral tales are more than just campfire stories. They are the cultural echoes of a trauma, a way for the land itself to remember a horror that official history tried to seal away in stone. Whether her death was from natural causes, despair, or something more sinister, the truth died with her in those sealed rooms. Her end forces us to confront a chilling possibility. Perhaps the greatest punishment was not the death of her body, but the meticulous erasure of her humanity, leaving behind only the monster, a hollow shell for our collective fears to inhabit forever. Even before the final stone was laid in her prison wall, the machinery of erasure was already in motion. King Matthias and his court moved with breathtaking speed to seize everything she had owned. Her vast estates, her castles, her immense wealth, all of it was absorbed by the crown, wiping clean the king's substantial debts in a single, decisive action. But the land grab was only half the victory. To make the theft permanent and just, they had to ensure her name was permanently stained, her humanity completely erased from the public memory. A coordinated propaganda campaign began almost immediately, designed to transform a complex, powerful noblewoman into a simple, monstrous archetype. Official court documents were circulated, detailing the most shocking accusations in dry, legalistic language that gave them an air of unassailable truth. Pamphlets and broadsheets, the social media of the 17th century, spread the sensational stories far beyond the courtroom, carrying the tale of the blood-drinking countess to every corner of Europe. Her story was carefully molded into the ultimate cautionary tale. It was a warning about the dangers of female power left unchecked, a lesson about what happens when a woman steps too far outside her prescribed role. By painting her as an inhuman demon, they justified their own actions and created a villain so compelling that her story would never be forgotten, even as the truth of her life was systematically buried. The legend was not an organic growth from the facts. It was a weapon, deliberately forged and deployed to secure a political victory and ensure that no one would ever question the justice of a king robbing a woman of her entire world. The silence of her brick tomb was not the only void left behind. In the weeks and months following Elizabeth Báthory's death, a different kind of erasure was taking place, a quiet purge of paper and parchment. The official narrative was secure, but the full, unedited truth was a threat. We must ask, what vanished from the Bathory archives? Consider the personal letters that were almost certainly burned. These would have been her correspondence with other powerful nobles, her financial agents, and perhaps even with the king himself. Such documents would not have detailed torture. They would have detailed business. They would have shown the mind of a brilliant, ruthless estate manager, a woman fiercely protecting her family's wealth and negotiating from a position of immense strength. They would have revealed the mounting tensions over the crown's debts, the polite but firm demands for repayment that would have painted a very clear motive for her downfall. Then there were her household account books. A complete, unaltered ledger would have listed every expense, from candles and cloth to payments to servants and their families. The sudden disappearance of a maid would have required a financial notation, a payoff to quiet a grieving family, a systematic pattern of such payments, or their conspicuous absence would have provided concrete, numerical evidence supporting or disproving the scale of the accusations. These mundane records could have been the most damning evidence of all, or they could have revealed a much more ordinary, if still harsh, world. Most tantalizing are the whispers of a personal diary. If she kept one, it would have been the first thing seized and destroyed. Its pages might have held the key to everything, her own voice explaining her actions. Was it filled with the ramblings of a sadist or the calculations of a politician? Did it speak of occult rituals learned from Dorothea, detailing a desperate belief in the power of blood magic, or did it instead contain the fears of a powerful woman trapped in a man's world, watching her enemies circle and documenting their conspiracies against her? The destruction of these uncensored archives was the final act of her conviction. It ensured that the only Elizabeth Báthory we would ever know is the one her enemies constructed, a monster carved from rumor and political necessity, her own voice forever lost to the fire. Her legend did not die within those stone walls. It simply found a new shape in the folklore of the land. The whispers of Elizabeth Báthory seeped into the rich soil of Eastern Europe, merging with ancient tales of the undead that had haunted the region for centuries. The vampire of local myth was not a charming count, but a bloated peasant revenant, a corpse that rose from its grave to plague its own family and village. It was a monster of the earth, of soil and sickness, but the story of the Blood Countess transformed this folkloric creature. She provided a new, terrifying template, the aristocratic vampire. This was not a shambling peasant from the churchyard, but a beautiful, powerful noble, preying on the lifeblood of the lower classes from within the walls of her own castle. Her alleged crimes, especially the blood bathing, shifted the vampires feeding from a mere physical hunger to a calculated, aesthetic pursuit of eternal youth and power. The vampire was no longer just a hungry corpse. It was a corrupt aristocrat, consuming the vitality of the peasantry to sustain its own decadent existence. This fusion of true crime and superstition created a potent new myth, one that perfectly captured the era's deep-seated fears of the predatory upper class. How does a real-life horror story evolve into a cultural archetype that resonates for centuries? The answer lies in the shadowy space where history meets our deepest anxieties. This new archetype would find its first great expression in literature through Sheridan Le Fan's Carmilla, published in 1872. The novella features a beautiful, enigmatic countess who preys exclusively on young women, ensnaring them with intimacy before draining their life force. Carmilla is no feral beast. She is refined, seductive, and utterly parasitic, a direct literary descendant of the Bathory narrative. She embodies the fear of the corrupting aristocratic influence, the horror of a beauty that masks a soul-devouring hunger. This character, in turn, paved the way for the most famous vampire of all. While Bram Stoker's Dracula drew on the history of Vlad, the Impaler, for his name and his malevolence, the Count's aristocratic grandeur, his castle, and his allure owe a significant debt to the mythologized version of Elizabeth Báthory. Dracula is a nobleman of ancient lineage, living in isolated splendor, whose very existence depends on feeding on the blood of others. He is the ultimate expression of the predatory aristocrat, a figure made possible by the real-world whispers of a countess who supposedly bathed in the blood of her servants. The legend of the Blood Countess provided a crucial, missing piece for the modern vampire, transforming it from a peasant ghoul into a symbol of corrupt power, timeless beauty, and a hunger that transcends death itself. 4 centuries of silence separate us from the woman walled in at Čachtice. We cannot interview her, cannot ask what drove the cruelty detailed in those tainted testimonies. Yet, the patterns of her described behavior form a chilling profile that modern psychology can attempt to decipher, not to excuse, but to understand the architecture of a mind capable of such acts. The most compelling framework might be a severe narcissistic personality disorder, magnified to a monstrous degree by her absolute power. This is not simple vanity, but a pathological grandiosity, a profound lack of empathy, and a deep-seated belief that she was entitled to use other human beings as instruments for her own needs, whether for labor, for punishment, or for a twisted quest for rejuvenation. The systematic torture could be seen as an extreme expression of this, a way to reinforce her godlike dominance over the lives of others, to feel the ultimate control over life and death itself. Another lens through which to view her actions is antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive disregard for the rights and feelings of others, a deceitfulness, and a remorselessness. The calculated, repeated nature of the abuses, the intricate cover-ups, and the apparent lack of guilt all align with this diagnosis. Yet we must ask, was this an innate lack of conscience, or was it a conscience systematically eroded by a lifetime of being told she was above the law, that her bloodline made her fundamentally different from the peasants who served her? Her environment of unchecked authority may have acted as a greenhouse, cultivating a latent predisposition into full, horrific bloom. We must also consider the shadow of her family's history, the whispers of epilepsy and madness often linked to generations of inbreeding among the isolated European aristocracy. Could a genetic predisposition for mental instability have been her inheritance? Some historians and medical experts have even speculated about porphyria, a rare blood disorder that can cause photosensitivity, abdominal pain, and severe psychiatric symptoms including paranoia, anxiety, and even hallucinations. In an era with no understanding of biochemistry, the physical agony and mental confusion of such an illness could easily have been misinterpreted as demonic possession or sheer malice, potentially exacerbating a descent into brutality. The crucial distinction lies in separating the potential neurological or psychological conditions from the calculated acts of cruelty. A seizure or a hallucination might explain a single violent episode, but it cannot account for the years of methodical, organized torture carried out by a structured household. This points away from a simple psychosis and toward a deeply ingrained personality disorder, a fractured moral compass that guided deliberate choices. The legend of the bloodbaths adds another layer. If she genuinely believed in the occult power of blood, could this point to a delusional disorder, a break from reality so severe she was convinced of a magical solution to aging? Or was it merely the rationalization of a sadist, a story she told herself to justify her enjoyment of cruelty? Psychology offers us frameworks, not definitive answers. It allows us to see Elizabeth Báthory not as a mythical monster, but as a profoundly damaged human being, a product of corrupted genetics, a toxic environment of absolute power, and a psyche that may have shattered under the weight of its own entitlement. Does understanding the potential brokenness within her make her actions more comprehensible, or in some ways, even more terrifying? Her story escaped the dusty pages of history to find a new, vibrant, and terrifying life in our modern imagination. The legend of the Blood Countess has become a powerful raw material, endlessly reshaped by filmmakers, authors, and musicians to explore our deepest contemporary anxieties. In cinema, she has been portrayed as everything from a tragic romantic figure to a shrieking monster. Many films focus on the bloodbath legend, depicting her as a beautiful woman desperately clinging to her youth, her vanity curdling into homicidal madness. These stories often use her as a mirror, reflecting our own culture's obsessive fear of aging and the extreme, sometimes grotesque, lengths people will go to defy it. The castle dungeons and pale, aristocratic villainy provide a perfect Gothic backdrop, a familiar language of horror that translates her historical crimes into a visual nightmare. Yet these adaptations consistently strip away the complex political context, simplifying a tale of power and conspiracy into a more personal story of individual evil and supernatural desperation. Why does this specific simplification resonate so powerfully with us, even when we know the historical record is far more ambiguous? This resonance echoes powerfully through the world of heavy metal, a genre built on exploring darkness, power, and transgression. The Swedish band Bathory, one of the foundational acts of black metal, took her name as a banner. For them, Elizabeth Báthory was not a sad victim of politics, but an icon of ultimate rebellion and fearsome, autonomous power. Their music channeled the raw, chaotic energy of her myth, the shrieks and distorted guitars acting as a sonic representation of the screams from Čachtice Castle. In the subculture of metal, she is celebrated as a figure who broke all constraints, who pursued her own dark desires with a terrifying will, regardless of the cost. She represents a force of nature, a storm of cruelty that appeals to a genre fascinated by themes of anti-authority and the extremes of human potential. This adoption transforms her from a historical person into an archetype of pure, unchecked ID, a symbol that continues to inspire bands and fans who find a strange, dark empowerment in her legend. Simultaneously, the goth subculture embraced her for a different, yet equally compelling, set of reasons. Here, she is not a figure of chaotic power, but a tragic, romantic queen of the night. Goth aesthetics are drawn to her imagery, the pale skin, the dark gowns, the isolated castle, and the melancholy of eternal beauty purchased at a terrible price. She is a dark muse, a symbol of elegant decay and beautiful suffering. This interpretation often romanticizes her, focusing on the tragic isolation of her final years and the poetic horror of her alleged crimes. Novels and graphic novels have further expanded this vision, writing her inner thoughts and giving voice to her supposed motivations, sometimes even casting her as a misunderstood anti-heroine fighting against a patriarchal world. These retellings ask us to empathize, however cautiously, with her isolation and her rage, framing her actions as a monstrous response to a society that sought to cage her. This enduring fascination across so many forms of art reveals something fundamental about our own psyche. The figure of Elizabeth Báthory is a dark vessel into which we can pour our evolving fears. In one era, she embodies the terror of female power unleashed. In another, she becomes a critique of the decadent, predatory aristocracy. Today, she might represent the horror of the billionaire class, so removed from humanity they see others as mere resources to be consumed. Her story is flexible because its core components are universally unsettling: absolute power, the corruption of beauty, the fear of aging, and the terrifying question of what a human being is capable of when they believe there are no consequences. We keep retelling her story not to uncover the historical truth, but because we need the monster. We need the legend of the Blood Countess to give a name and a face to the formless dread of what can happen when privilege, madness, and a hunger for eternity collide. Her shadow extends far beyond the pages of history, finding a strange and unsettling home within the very traditions she was accused of violating. In the hidden corners of modern occultism, particularly among those who walk the left-hand path, Elizabeth Báthory has been resurrected as a dark archetype. These traditions, which often emphasize personal liberation through the conscious exploration of taboo and the embrace of the shadow self, see in her a powerful, if terrifying, symbol. She is recast not as a monster, but as a radical icon of feminine power unleashed from all societal and moral constraints. For some practitioners, her legend represents the ultimate transgression, a woman who seized absolute autonomy over life and death, who dared to touch the forbidden mysteries of blood and vitality, and who paid the ultimate price for her pursuit. This interpretation views her alleged crimes as a brutal, literal manifestation of a metaphysical principle, the consumption of life force to fuel one's own ascension, a path of power that refuses to apologize for its own darkness. The bloodbath, in this context, is stripped of its historical ambiguity and transformed into a potent, albeit horrifying, ritual of self-deification. It becomes the ultimate act of will, a declaration that one's own eternity is worth any sacrifice, yet this romanticization is profoundly problematic. Can a figure linked to the torture and murder of innocent young women ever be a valid symbol of empowerment? Or does this simply dress up profound cruelty in the language of spiritual rebellion? The embrace of such a dark archetype forces a difficult conversation about the limits of esoteric symbolism and the danger of glorifying historical trauma in the search for personal power. It asks us where the line lies between embracing one's shadow and becoming consumed by it entirely. Her enduring presence in these spaces proves that her story is not just a historical case, but a mirror reflecting our own deepest struggles with power, taboo, and the price of absolute freedom. The stone walls of Čachtice Castle have kept their secrets stubbornly locked away. Despite the vivid testimonies and the enduring legend, the physical proof of the dungeons and the suffering they contained has proven remarkably elusive to modern science. Archaeological digs have repeatedly targeted the fortress ruins, their ground-penetrating radar and trowels searching for the blueprint of the horror story. They seek the specific layout of the infamous torture chambers and the lost entrance to the lower dungeons described in the trial records. Yet, the castle's crumbling architecture refuses to yield a clear map of its own darkness. The locations of the described torture devices, the spiked cage, the Iron Maidens, they have all melted back into the imagination, leaving no definitive trace in the stone and soil. This absence is not an exoneration, but a complication. It forces us to ask whether these specific implements were literary embellishments added to the legend, or if the passage of 4 centuries has simply erased the evidence too thoroughly for us to find. The most poignant search has been for the victims themselves. Where are the bodies? If hundreds of young women were killed within the castle, as the accusations claim, there must be mass graves. Forensic teams have scanned the surrounding land, looking for the telltale disturbances in the earth that signal a hidden pit of bones, but no such site has ever been conclusively identified. This profound lack of physical evidence is a silent enigma at the heart of the story. Does it mean the scale of the killings was wildly exaggerated by her enemies? Or does it instead speak to the terrifying efficiency of her inner circle, who may have disposed of the remains with a gruesome thoroughness that has baffled even modern technology? The Earth's refusal to give up its dead leaves us suspended between history and rumor, forever wondering if the stones are hiding the truth, or if the real horror was that there were far fewer bodies than the stories claim. 4 centuries of accusations have failed to bury the most basic questions. If the horrors within Čachtice Castle were as vast as the trial claimed, then where are the bodies? The testimonies spoke of hundreds of victims, a systematic culling of young women over many years, yet the earth around the castle ruins holds no mass graves, no hidden pits filled with bones that would offer the silent, undeniable proof modern science craves. This absence is a profound mystery. Were the remains disposed of with a gruesome efficiency that has eluded even our most advanced ground-penetrating radar? Or does this chilling void point to a different, more political truth, that the numbers were a deliberate exaggeration designed to shock a nation and justify a theft? This leads directly to another gaping hole in the historical record. Why was there never any kind of contemporary forensic investigation? The 17th century was not without its own forms of rudimentary forensics, but in this case, the prosecutors relied entirely on whispered testimony and coerced confessions. There were no official examinations of the alleged torture chambers, no inventories of the specific tools described, no medical inspections of the accused or the sites where these acts were said to have taken place. The case was built on words alone, words extracted under torture, a foundation of sand that has eroded with time, leaving us with the shell of a story, but not its substance. Perhaps the most tantalizing question of all involves the missing voice at the center of this storm. What personal writings of Elizabeth Báthory might still be hidden away in a forgotten archive or a private collection? We know her household accounts and personal correspondence were almost certainly seized and destroyed, but what if a single letter survived? A diary entry, a fragment of a ledger, a note to a confidant, any piece of her own unmediated voice would be revolutionary. Would such a document reveal the frantic calculations of a woman trying to protect her wealth from circling enemies? Would it confess to a belief in the dark rituals she was accused of, detailing her occult studies with Dorothea? Or would it simply show the mundane, brutal reality of managing a vast estate in a harsh time, a record of punishments that, while severe, were tragically commonplace for the era? The answers to these questions hold the power to shatter a 400-year-old legend or to cement it in a truth far more terrifying than any fable. The silence surrounding these mysteries is what truly keeps the story of the Blood Countess alive, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest because we have never found its bones. So we are left with a portrait painted in starkly contrasting colors. On one hand, we have the detailed, horrific accusations of systematic torture and murder, a narrative so monstrous it feels complete. On the other, we have the undeniable political and financial motives of a king desperate to erase his debts and a patriarchy threatened by a woman's power. To simply choose one over the other is to miss the terrifying, complex truth. Elizabeth Báthory was likely not a simple monster, but a deeply flawed human being whose real crimes were amplified and distorted into a legend to serve a political agenda. She was a product of her time, born into a dynasty shadowed by rumors of madness and epilepsy, given absolute authority in a remote castle, and left to stew in the potent cocktail of isolation and impunity. Her documented harshness towards servants, while cruel, was not entirely out of step with the brutal norms of the era for disciplining the lower classes. But it was her gender that made her uniquely vulnerable. A man exhibiting the same ruthless control over his estates would have been called a strong lord. A woman doing the same was an unnatural threat, a perversion of the social order that needed to be corrected. This fear of female power provided the perfect kindling for the fire her enemies wanted to light. Then we must add the final, crucial ingredient, the dark intellectual currents of the Renaissance, the era's obsession with alchemy, vitalism, and the hidden properties of blood created a cultural script for her alleged actions. Whether she truly believed in the occult power of blood magic, guided by Bthory, or whether that story was simply grafted onto her by others, it provided a framework that made her cruelty seem not just sadistic, but purposefully demonic. The real Elizabeth Báthory probably existed in the murky space between these extremes. She was likely a cruel and authoritarian noblewoman whose actions provided just enough factual kindling for her rivals to build a bonfire of lies. They took her real transgressions, exaggerated the scale and the sensationalism, and wrapped it all in the most terrifying occult packaging they could find. The result was a perfect storm, a narrative that destroyed a powerful woman, enriched a king, and created a monster for the ages. This nuanced view does not absolve her of the suffering she caused, but it complicates our understanding of guilt. It asks us to consider whether the greater crime was the torture within the castle walls, or the calculated, state-sanctioned destruction of a human being for power and profit. Her story is not a simple tale of good and evil, but a haunting lesson in how history is written by the victors, and how a monster can be manufactured when it becomes politically convenient. Her legacy is a tapestry woven with equal parts blood and shadow, a story where historical fact blurs into deliberate fiction. We have journeyed through the uncensored archives and found not a simple monster, but a complex portrait of a woman, her era, and the powerful forces that conspired to destroy her. The truth of Elizabeth Báthory lies in the unsettling space between these threads, in the cruel reality of her actions, the undeniable political conspiracy against her, and the dark esoteric beliefs that may have guided her hand. She becomes a mirror reflecting our deepest fears, the terror of absolute power corrupted, the ancient hunger for eternal youth, and the systemic injustice that can manufacture a monster to serve its own ends. This story challenges us to question the very nature of evil itself. Is it born from a single broken mind, or is it cultivated by a society that grants impunity and then feasts on the scandal of its own creation? The legend of the Blood Countess endures not because we have solved her mystery, but because we have not. It forces us to wonder which is more terrifying, a world where such a monster could truly exist, or a world where the truth is so fragile it can be entombed forever by a king's greed. The archives may be censored, but the questions remain. What do you believe lies at the heart of this 400-year-old darkness? Share your theories below, and if you are drawn to the shadows where history and mystery meet, subscribe for more journeys into the occult and esoteric. The past has more secrets